Inside Pelican Bay State Prison, America's most notorious lockdown facility. The edge of America. On the far northern edge of California, where the Pacific Ocean meets dense redwood forests and the nearest major city is hours away, sits one of the most isolated prisons in the United States. Pelican Bay State Prison. It was designed not for rehabilitation, not for reintegration, but for total control. For decades, Pelican Bay has housed some of California's most feared inmates. Men deemed so dangerous, so influential, or so disruptive that the state believed extreme isolation was the only answer. This facility became a national symbol of long-term solitary confinement. A testing ground for policies that would later face lawsuits, hunger strikes, and global human rights scrutiny. What happens inside Pelican Bay is not rumor. It is documented, litigated, and still debated. Tonight, we take you inside. Before we continue, if you value deeply researched, factual prison documentaries like this one, support the work by liking this video and subscribing to Beyond the Bars. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that are accurate, in-depth, and often difficult, but necessary, to tell. Why Pelican Bay was built. To understand Pelican Bay, you have to go back to California in the late 1980s. At the time, the state prison system was under immense pressure. Overcrowding was severe. Violence was rising. And prison gangs, particularly racially aligned gangs, were exerting growing influence both inside and outside prison walls. California officials believed traditional maximum security prisons were no longer sufficient to contain certain inmates. The solution they proposed was radical. A super-maximum security prison, often called a Supermax, designed to isolate inmates almost completely from one another, from staff, and from the outside world. Construction on Pelican Bay State Prison began in 1989. It officially opened in 1990, near the small town of Crescent City, just miles from the Oregon border. Its remote location was intentional. Isolation, both physical and psychological, was built into the design. The architecture of control. Pelican Bay was not built like older prisons. There were no large cell blocks filled with rows of inmates. No communal yards. No dining halls for most of the population. Instead, the prison was divided into specialized units, each designed for a specific level of control. At the heart of Pelican Bay was the Security Housing Unit. The SHU. This is where the prison earned its reputation. Cells in the SHU measure approximately 8 by 10 feet. They are made of poured concrete. Furnishings, bed, desk, stool, are molded directly into the structure. The doors are solid steel. Human contact is intentionally minimized. For years, inmates in the SHU were confined to their cells for approximately 22 to 23 hours a day. Exercise, when permitted, took place alone, in small concrete enclosures often referred to as dog runs. Who was sent to the SHU? Officially, placement in the SHU was not based on a single violent act alone. Many inmates were sent there under California's gang validation policy. Under this system, prisoners could be classified as gang members or associates based on evidence such as confidential informant statements, artwork or written materials, association with other validated inmates. Once validated, inmates could be placed in the SHU for indeterminate terms, meaning there was no fixed release date. Some men remained in isolation for years. Others for decades. In many cases, the length of confinement depended not on behavior, but on whether an inmate could successfully debrief, a process that required providing information about gang activity. This policy would later become one of the most controversial aspects of Pelican Bay. Daily life in extreme isolation. Life inside the SHU followed a rigid, repetitive routine. Meals were delivered through a slot in the cell door. Conversations with staff were brief and procedural. Contact with other inmates was often limited to distant voices echoing through concrete corridors. Windows, when present, did not face the outside world. Some inmates reported going years without seeing trees, traffic, or faces beyond guards. Mental health experts later testified that such conditions could have profound psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. These concerns were not speculative. They would become central to legal challenges against the state of California. Early warning signs. By the mid-1990s, Pelican Bay was already facing legal scrutiny. In 1995, a federal court case, Madrid versus Gomez, examined conditions inside the prison. The court did not declare the SHU unconstitutional in all cases. But it did rule that placing inmates with serious mental illness in such extreme isolation violated the Eighth Amendment. The findings acknowledged something critical. Pelican Bay was functioning as designed. And that design came with severe human costs. A reputation that spread nationwide. Over time, Pelican Bay became a reference point. Other states built their own Supermax prisons, often citing California's model. Academics studied it. Human rights organizations condemned it. Lawmakers defended it as necessary for safety. The prison's name began appearing in international reports on solitary confinement. What was once a remote facility on the edge of America had become a symbol in a global debate. And the most significant challenges to Pelican Bay were still to come. The silent organizers. Pelican Bay was designed to prevent communication. No shared cells. No group recreation. No physical contact. And yet, communication still happened. Inmates in the SHU learned to pass messages through plumbing pipes, ventilation systems, and coded notes known as kites. Others communicated by shouting through vents during moments when noise carried. These methods were slow, risky, and heavily monitored. But they worked well enough to allow something unprecedented to form inside one of the most restrictive prison environments in the world. Coordination. The first hunger strike, 2011. In July 2011, inmates housed in Pelican Bay's SHU launched a hunger strike. The action was peaceful, non-violent, and carefully organized. Participants refused food to protest long-term solitary confinement and the gang validation process that kept many of them in isolation indefinitely. The demands were specific and documented. They included an end to group punishment, clear criteria for SHU placement, access to basic privileges, an end to indefinite isolation without meaningful review. Within days, the strike spread. More than 6,000 inmates across California eventually participated, making it one of the largest prison hunger strikes in U.S. history. The state responds. California prison officials acknowledged the strike but rejected claims of systemic abuse. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation stated that SHU placement was necessary for safety and gang suppression. Negotiations occurred. Some concessions were promised. But many inmates returned to the SHU under largely unchanged conditions. The hunger strike ended, but the conflict did not. A second, larger strike, 2013. In 2013, inmates tried again. This time, the hunger strike was larger, longer, and more coordinated. At its peak, more than 30,000 inmates across California refused meals. Some participants had been in solitary confinement for over 20 years. Medical staff monitored deteriorating health. Attorneys filed emergency motions. Public attention intensified. For the first time, Pelican Bay was no longer just a prison issue. It was a statewide, and national, reckoning. Inside the courtroom, Ashker v. California. In 2012, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of Pelican Bay SHU inmates. The case became known as Ashker versus Governor of California. Plaintiffs argued that indefinite solitary confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Gang validation relied on unreliable evidence. Inmates had no meaningful path out of the SHU. The state denied wrongdoing. But after years of litigation, something unprecedented happened. California agreed to settle. A settlement that changed everything, 2015. In 2015, the settlement was finalized. Its impact was historic. California agreed to end indefinite SHU confinement based solely on gang validation. Create a new step-down program. Limit long-term solitary confinement. Release thousands of inmates from isolation into general population or less restrictive housing. Pelican Bay's SHU population dropped dramatically. Men who had spent decades in near-total isolation were suddenly reintroduced to human contact. The prison, and the system, was forced to change. The aftermath. The reforms did not end controversy. Some correctional officers warned of increased violence. Some inmates reported difficulty adjusting after years of isolation. Advocates argued reforms did not go far enough. What is clear is this. Pelican Bay would never again operate the way it once did. But its legacy, both physical and psychological, remains. A symbol that endures. Pelican Bay State Prison was built to disappear people. Not in secret, but in plain sight. Its walls still stand. Its cells still exist. But its role in American corrections has fundamentally changed. Whether it is remembered as a necessary security measure or a cautionary tale, depends on who is telling the story. What cannot be disputed is this. Pelican Bay reshaped the national conversation about punishment, isolation, and the limits of state power. And that conversation is far from over. Pelican Bay today. Pelican Bay State Prison still operates today. It remains one of California's highest security facilities, housing inmates convicted of serious and often violent crimes. But the institution that exists now is not the same Pelican Bay that defined the Supermax era of the 1990s and early 2000s. Following the 2015 settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California, the prison's use of long-term solitary confinement changed substantially. The security housing unit still exists, but it no longer functions as a warehouse for indefinite isolation based solely on gang affiliation. Instead, housing decisions are now tied more directly to individual behavior and disciplinary violations. The step-down program. One of the most significant changes introduced after the settlement was the step-down program. This program was designed to transition inmates out of restrictive housing gradually, rather than keeping them isolated for years without a clear endpoint. The process includes multiple phases. Each phase allows increased social interaction, access to programming, and limited privileges, if inmates meet specific behavioral requirements. According to CDCR data, thousands of inmates previously held in solitary confinement were transferred into these programs statewide. However, participation and outcomes vary. Some inmates successfully reintegrated into general population housing. Others struggled with the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Psychological aftereffects. Mental health professionals have documented that extended solitary confinement can have lasting effects. Former SHU inmates have reported difficulty with social interaction, emotional regulation, sleep, trust, decision-making. These accounts were included in court testimony and post-release interviews, though experiences vary significantly between individuals. Experts caution that there is no single outcome. Some inmates adapt over time. Others require long-term psychological support. The long-term impact of isolation remains an active area of academic research. Correctional officer perspectives. Correctional officers at Pelican Bay have offered their own perspective. Some argue that the SHU was an essential tool for controlling violence and preventing gang-directed attacks inside prisons. Union representatives have stated that restrictions on isolation reduced staff leverage over inmates considered highly dangerous. Others within the system acknowledged that earlier policies lacked sufficient oversight and relied too heavily on intelligence that was difficult to verify. These perspectives are often in conflict. They reflect an ongoing debate within corrections, not just in California, but nationwide. Violence and safety after reforms. One of the most contested questions following the reforms was whether reducing solitary confinement would increase violence. Publicly available CDCR data shows mixed results. Some facilities reported temporary increases in assaults during transition periods. Others saw little change. There is no definitive consensus linking the reduction of solitary confinement at Pelican Bay directly to long-term increases or decreases in violence. Researchers caution against drawing simple conclusions from complex systems. Pelican Bay in the global context. Pelican Bay has been cited in international discussions about solitary confinement. Human rights organizations, including United Nations-affiliated bodies, have referenced U.S. Supermax prisons when criticizing prolonged isolation. While international standards are not legally binding on U.S. prisons, they have influenced academic research, advocacy efforts, and public opinion. Pelican Bay is frequently used as a case study, both by critics and defenders of restrictive housing. The men who left the shoe. Some men who spent years, or decades, in Pelican Bay's SHU have since been released into the general prison population. A smaller number have returned to society after completing their sentences. Public interviews and court records indicate that reintegration is often difficult. The world they re-enter is unfamiliar. Technology has changed. Social expectations have shifted. These outcomes were not universally predicted when Pelican Bay was built. What Pelican Bay represents now. Today, Pelican Bay stands as both an active prison and a historical marker. It represents a period when extreme isolation was considered an acceptable solution to complex institutional problems. It also represents a moment when inmates, through legal action and nonviolent protest, forced one of the largest prison systems in the world to change course. Pelican Bay did not close. But its purpose evolved. Unresolved questions. The questions raised by Pelican Bay remain unresolved. How much isolation is too much? Can security exist without psychological harm? And where should the line be drawn between control and human dignity? There are no simple answers. Only records. Rulings. And consequences. The legacy of a Supermax. Pelican Bay State Prison did not emerge in isolation. It was part of a national shift in the late 20th century, a period when control, containment, and risk management dominated correctional thinking in the United States. Its security housing unit became one of the most studied and controversial examples of long-term solitary confinement anywhere in the world. Court rulings, academic research, and inmate litigation forced California to confront the long-term consequences of that model. What followed was not the closure of Pelican Bay, but its transformation. Influence beyond California. The legal and policy changes tied to Pelican Bay reached far beyond California. Other states revised their use of restrictive housing. Federal courts cited Pelican Bay cases in broader Eighth Amendment discussions. Correctional systems began re-evaluating indefinite isolation practices. While solitary confinement still exists in the United States, Pelican Bay altered how it is legally justified, monitored, and challenged. Its impact is now embedded in modern correctional policy. Pelican Bay remains operational. The concrete has not changed. The remoteness has not changed. But the assumptions behind how power is exercised inside its walls have. It stands today as a reminder of how policy decisions, made far from prison cells, can shape human lives for decades. Pelican Bay is not just a place. It is a record. The story of Pelican Bay is not about good versus evil. It is about systems. Fear. Control. And the consequences of isolation carried to its extreme. What happened there is documented. Challenged. and still shaping the future of American corrections. And that story, like the debate it sparked, is not finished. If you value factual, deeply researched prison documentaries, support the work by liking this video and subscribing to Beyond the Bars. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories, accurately, responsibly, and without exaggeration. Thank you for watching.